A global view, live from London, is City News International.
City News International.
City Noticias Internacionales.
Notícias Internacionais.
City News International. Habari za City.
City 国际新闻。
This is City News International.
Good afternoon and welcome to the political edition of City News International. I'm Georgia Ziebart.
And I'm Ayanda Nduli. Today's top stories.
US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson are meeting in southwest England ahead of tomorrow's G7 summit.
Mr. Biden is expected to offer 500 million vaccine doses to developing nations. And
At least 51 children have been kidnapped by Islamist militant groups in northern Mozambique in the last year, according to a new report.
Political edition on City News International.
As we speak, US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson are meeting in Cornwall ahead of tomorrow's G7 summit. The G7 is made up of the world's wealthiest democracies, including France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. On his first overseas visit since becoming president, Mr. Biden aims to refresh US-UK relations through tensions rising to Northern Ireland continue to grow. Joining us live is Scott Lucas, political analyst and Clinton Institute associate at University College Dublin. Professor Lucas, hello. Only 2 days ago, Downing Street described the term special relationship as needy and weak. Now, Mr. Johnson and Mr. Biden have announced a renewal of the Atlantic Charter. Why the sudden change, especially after Mr. Biden warned the UK over its stance on Northern Ireland?
I think it's called window dressing. The reality is that the special relationship is not weak. It's the UK which is weak, not only vis-a-vis the United States, but also vis-a-vis Europe and the rest of the world after the Brexit withdrawal. So Boris Johnson says, I'll play down the special relationship because I don't know what's going to come out of it. The window dressing is the Atlantic Charter. The 1941 Atlantic Charter said, okay, this is a blueprint for not only fighting the war against Germany and then later Japan, but it's also a blueprint for what is to come afterwards. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, conventions on human rights. This 2021 version, all it has in it is a desire to renew travel between the US and the UK, which I certainly welcome amidst the coronavirus pandemic, and let's make it easier for British technology companies to trade in the United States. That's not the same as the 1941 Atlantic Charter. In other words, this is window dressing on what is a crumbling house, because the headline story that will replace this, and already is replacing it, is that the Americans have warned the British, as Biden meets Johnson, if you do not get yourself in order over the Northern Irish Protocol and the Brexit Agreement, if you do not make sure that you are advancing stability on the Irish island rather than instability, you don't get a trade agreement from us. And indeed, you will have no special relationship.
And the US wants to convince its Western allies in the G7 to present a united front against China. How much does Mr. Biden value the UK as a partner against an increasingly assertive China?
Oh, I mean, the UK is still valued as an ally. This isn't that, we've sailed off and sunk in the Atlantic as of January. But the UK is not first amongst equals. The UK is one of a number of American allies. And significantly, the American priorities now are, for example, with some of the countries that have been invited to the G7 as observers, like India and Australia, think about the Asian dimension, and South Korea, and with the European Union, which has 27 countries, as opposed to only one here in the UK.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Lucas.
Thank you.
Now, the summit will be President Biden's first major event on the world stage. Tom Cole has more on the expectations ahead of this meeting.
We're going to make it clear that the United States is back and democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges and the issues that matter most to our future.
That was US President Joe Biden speaking to members of the US military at the British Air Force Base RAF Mildenhall last night. Biden is in the UK as part of a 6-day whirlwind tour of 3 European countries. This includes the annual G7 meeting with other heads of government of other major world economies. Sir Stephen Wall, a former British ambassador who also served at the British Embassy in Washington, believes that this summit will be President Biden's big opportunity.
I mean, the most significant thing about it, seems to me, is that, this is a return to coherence among the West under new American leadership. I mean, Joe Biden's first G7 summit, that seems to me to be by far and away the most important part of it. It's really an opportunity for the Americans to resume leadership of the free world.
Sir Stephen also believes that when it comes to British foreign policy, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson will find it easier to deal with the Biden administration in comparison to that of his predecessor, Donald Trump.
I mean, I think on the whole, any British government is more comfortable with the kind of government that Biden is leading, not least because on issues such as climate change, where in fairness to him, Boris Johnson has always been kind of on the side of the angels, we clearly have much more in common, much more in tune really with this administration than with the previous one.
President Biden's worldview differs very much from that of the Trump-era America First. Lord John Kerr, who served as British ambassador in Washington in the mid-1990s, believes that now the focus will be on whether President Biden can actually deliver.
This is a Biden summit. It is America is back. Biden's signal at the Munich Security Conference in February turns out to be exactly correct. The United States again believes in multilateral diplomacy. The United States again believes in trying to take the lead and set the agenda.
Last weekend, Joe Biden wrote the following in an opinion piece in the Washington Post. Can democracies come together to deliver real results for our people in a rapidly changing world? I believe the answer is yes. And this week in Europe, we have the chance to prove it. The question at the G7 will be, can he translate these words into action? This is Thomas Cole reporting for City News International.
That was Tom Cole, who joins us now. Tom, what's going to be top of the agenda?
Thank you, Ayanda. So G7 leaders will be primarily focusing on the global response to COVID-19 as well as on climate change. And climate change is one of the most high-profile and emotive issues being brought to the table. Earlier, our climate correspondent Lillian Fawcett spoke to Ida Middlemiss Frost, a 16-year-old activist from Cornwall.
If you could speak directly to the G7 leaders, what would you say to them?
I would ask them to look past the beautiful scenic landscape and everything down in Cornwall and to see the poverty and the effects of climate change and all of the inequality that is down here that might be masked by the beauty of having the G7 conference in Carbis Bay, and for them to look past that and understand the reality of the effects of climate change on my generation, and particularly down here in Cornwall as being such a coastal area.
What are then some of the effects that Cornwall is seeing from climate change already?
So it's things like obviously coastal erosion and changes with the fishing community, which is obviously a big industry in Cornwall, and farming with changes with the weather patterns and climate and everything. Obviously parts of the cliff falling away, and a lot of coastal communities will be hit particularly hard by that.
Now, when it comes to climate change issues, there is definitely an ambition from G7 leaders to do more, but they'll be discussing other issues as well. And despite not being on the agenda, EU-UK relations, will feature in the margins, namely Northern Ireland and its goods trade with the rest of the UK. Other issues likely to be discussed include how the West responds to the challenge of a more influential China, and also relations with Russia as well.
President Biden plans to buy 500 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine. These will be distributed to 92 of the lowest income countries, including those in the African Union, by 2022. This follows criticism that the G7 countries were not contributing enough to the global distribution of vaccines. Our correspondent, Olivia Briand, has more on the story. Olivia, could you give us some background and explain what this could mean?
This is all about rich countries having vaccines and poor countries going without. It's sometimes called vaccine apartheid. This is partly because wealthier countries were the first to sign deals with vaccine distributors and ordered huge numbers of doses for their own populations. As of April, less than 2% of all COVID vaccines administered globally went to Africa. Currently, not even 1% of the South African population is fully vaccinated. To put this in perspective, South Africa is one of the most vaccinated countries on the African continent. And what's also important to think about here is where African countries are getting their vaccine supplies from. So China already donated 20 million vaccines to the continent of their promised 44 million, and they donated more than any other nation so far, but it's still a relatively small number compared to the needs of the continent. China is looking to increase foreign relations, trade and loans with African and other developing nations, and they call this their Belt and Road Initiative, which has advantages for the Chinese economy. Countries in Africa can supply China with natural resources such as copper from Zambia, and it's also a source of cheaper labor. Wu Peng, Director General of the Africa Department at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has called for support for the local manufacturing of vaccines in Africa. I asked Mark Eggleston-Turner, a lecturer in global health law at Keele University, about China's motivations for investing in Africa.
We know that China, through the Belt Road Initiative, has huge economic interests in Africa. So that quite possibly could be a motivator here. We ask these sort of questions when countries like China or Russia are seen to do good. We never ask that question when it's the UK doing humanitarian actions or the US.
It is now known that at least 51 children were abducted in northern Mozambique in the last year. A report from charity Save the Children accuses Islamist groups of terrorizing the area, sexually assaulting women, and beheading children. Save the Children warns that abduction is a new and alarmingly regular tactic by armed groups. Nearly 750,000 people have been displaced as a result of violence in the country. We are now joined live by Tom Bowker, the editor of Zitamar News, who's been following the conflict. Tom, thank you for joining us. Could you touch on what the origins of the conflict are? Tom, excuse me, can you hear me? All right, I'm sorry, guys. Unfortunately, we're experiencing technical difficulties. So moving on.
This is
City News.
The Israeli court has postponed its decision on an appeal lodged by 2 Palestinian families facing eviction from their homes in East Jerusalem. This comes after mass protests in another East Jerusalem neighbourhood, Sheikh Jarrah, where 300 people are also facing eviction. Joining us now is our Middle East correspondent, Agnese Bofano. Agnese, why is today's decision so symbolic?
Today's decision comes on a very important anniversary. The so-called 1967 war between Israel and neighbouring Arab states ended on this day 54 years ago. The outcome was essentially the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which was previously under Jordanian jurisdiction. But for many Palestinian families facing eviction, like the 2 families previously mentioned, this is a continuation of the occupation that came after what Israel calls the Six-Day War. But essentially, Israel's continued policy of annexation is directly linked to 1967. And I prepared a short clip here on the historical significance of the event. 1967. A war that lasted only 6 days, but one that still defines the region.
Well, the basic philosophy of Israel was not to initiate war unless an act of war was carried out against us.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin talking about Israel's military victory. From Egypt, Israel gained the Sinai Peninsula. From Syria, Israel gained the Golan Heights. And from Jordan, as Dr. Yair Wallach, a senior lecturer in Israeli studies at SOAS University, explains, Israel gained 3 strategic locations, including East Jerusalem.
One is East Jerusalem, which was part of the occupied territories in 1967, but then incorporated unilaterally into Israel, but in a manner that, was against the wishes of the local population, but also did not give them or position them in an inferior status and residency.
But while these territorial changes were made over 50 years ago, Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem continue to feel the effects of the occupation.
We now have Tom back on the line, and here, Tom, welcome back. So my question to you is just, why are children being targeted?
Well, without being able to know the motivations exactly, I mean, I think, unfortunately, the thing that we probably can suspect is that the insurgency is using child soldiers, and there has been evidence of that recently, particularly in the recent attack on Palma, which gained so much attention. I mean, this insurgency has been going on for, it's coming up for 4 years now, but the abduction of children, has been particularly noticed over the last year to 18 months. And I think the use of child soldiers has been notorious in, I guess, comparable situations like the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. I guess these extremist movements find boys and girls easier to brainwash and bring them on side and use them as child soldiers. And the tragedy is that these are lives which are being destroyed really right from the very beginning.
Thank you so much for your answer, and thank you for your contribution, Tom. Coming up in today's show later on, COVID-19 vaccine technology could lead to a breakthrough finding a cure for HIV.
And the return of the Cannes Film Festival sparks a glimmer of hope for the film industry. Let us know which film you're excited to see via our social media.
You can follow us on Twitter at the 5 Time Zones and interact with our team. Your participation is important to us because together we are part of City News International.
Yes. All right. Okay, no worries. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Welcome back. Welcome back. The time here in London is 3:16.
This is
City News.
We now head to Sadie for Global News Roundup. Sadie, what do our listeners need to hear?
Hi, Ayanda. So, here in the UK, Health Secretary Matt Hancock is giving evidence to Parliament about the government's coronavirus response. He denies claims by Dominic Cummings, the former special advisor to the Prime Minister, that he has ever lied. But Mr. Cummings is saying Mr. Hancock should have been sacked at least 15 or 20 times for not telling the truth.
Matt Hancock said today that the Delta variant is now responsible for 91% of COVID cases in the UK. How is this COVID situation in the rest of the world?
So the biggest COVID story today is from India, who reported the highest single-day rise in deaths by any country so far, reaching over 6,000. One state nearly doubled its death toll after counting people who died in private hospitals or at home. So this is raising serious concerns over the accuracy of previously recorded death tolls over there.
I see. In Myanmar, the news broke this morning that former leader Aung San Suu Kyi is facing new charges from the military. What is that about?
She is indeed. This is her most serious charge to date. She's accused of accepting bribes and could face up to 15 years in jail. Aung San Suu Kyi has been under house arrest since Myanmar's military seized power in a coup in February.
Is there any significant finance news today?
So the European Central Bank has revised its economic growth forecast for the next 2 years upwards. They're now predicting the Eurozone will grow 4.6% in 2021 and 4.7% in 2022. This is a signal of hope that the world's third largest economy has seen the worst of the economic devastation caused by the pandemic, and it should be all upwards from here. So that's all from me. Back to you guys in the studio.
Thank you so much, Sadie. We now head to Jorge Hinojosa with the weather.
I'm coming to you live from Barbican Market in North London. Unfortunately, today isn't as beautiful as it was yesterday because it is a little bit cloudy, but people are still enjoying out themselves on terrace but without sunglasses. The highest temperature is 24 degrees Celsius. But Londoners, don't worry, because the weekend is expected to be completely sunny. On Saturday, it will reach a high of 25 degrees, with Sunday being even hotter with a high of 28 degrees. In South Africa, the temperature is 17 degrees and it is cloudy. Coming back to the UK, city of Cornwall, where the G7 summit is taking place, there is a temperature of 16 degrees and it is completely cloudy. So unfortunately, the prime ministers and presidents of these countries will not be able to enjoy a swim at the beach after all the meetings and discussions. But don't worry, President Biden. It is expected to be really sunny in Brussels next Monday.
Come rain or shine, we've got you covered.
City News International.
This month marks 40 years since the first reported case of HIV in the United States. HIV, which can turn into AIDS, became a global epidemic. Years later, there still isn't a vaccine for HIV. But scientists say new technologies developed for COVID-19 vaccines could help. Thibaut Spirlet reports.
Scientists at the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer.
It was back in 1981 when an unknown virus started spreading within the gay community in the United States. 40 years later, we know a lot more about HIV and its treatment, but there is still no sign of an effective vaccine. Dr. Gary Spinner is an HIV specialist who has been treating AIDS since the beginning of the HIV epidemic in the 1980s.
We've had a couple of vaccine trials that looked a little encouraging early on and then did not prove to be efficacious. I don't know when we're going to have a vaccine. What I'm encouraged by is that the mRNA technology and with the rapid speed of the development of a COVID-19 vaccine re-energizes immunologists and people who develop vaccines to apply new technologies and new ways of thinking about vaccine development.
Immunologists have developed a new mRNA vaccine in record time during the COVID-19 pandemic. This type of vaccine teaches the cell how to make a protein that triggers an immune response inside our bodies. That immune response produces antibodies which protects patients from getting infected if the virus enters the body again. Developments in mRNA are exciting the scientific community looking for an HIV vaccine.
It's a great, interesting technology, of course.
That is Dr. Michael Gottlieb, the first American immunologist to identify AIDS as a new disease in 1981. He has his doubts.
But are they going to be able to create a mosaic mRNA vaccine that takes into account the diversity of HIVs sufficiently?
COVID-19 has a dozen variants, while HIV has thousands. That is a challenge for the pharmaceutical company Moderna, that will be testing 2 new mRNA vaccines for HIV this year. Moderna's chief executive officer says he expects the mRNA technology to be effective against HIV. The mRNA technology brings hope for an HIV vaccine. Thibaut Spirlet, City News International.
3 million people are facing drought and food shortages in Afghanistan, humanitarian organizations warn. The crisis will hit a country already struggling with the economic impacts of COVID-19 and worsening conflict as American troops withdraw. Our reporter Sanya Skov spoke with Eileen McCarthy, who works for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Kabul.
So what's the current scale of the crisis?
So what we're seeing now are the early stages of water shortages, especially in the northern and western parts of Afghanistan, where we know that more than 3 million Afghans are likely to be acutely affected by a drought this year. And our real concerns is that the drought this year would be even more devastating than one that people are struggling to recover from just 3 years ago.
What has been the international response to this crisis?
I think what we're seeing is that after decades of conflict, Afghanistan has really fallen down on the agenda internationally. And while discussions are tending recently to focus on the security and the political situation, often the impacts of these issues and the drought in particular are not considering the impacts on everyday Afghans and particularly those most vulnerable. So while we've seen some international donors starting to prepare for being able to fund a response, across the board, the humanitarian response in Afghanistan is extremely underfunded. I believe that the humanitarian response plan right now is about 16% funded.
Time to go to Jack Grogan-Fenn with the football-focused sports news.
This is City News International with your latest sports updates.
It's just over 24 hours until the start of Euro 2020. Turkey will face Italy in Rome, kicking off the tournament at 8 p.m. London time. This morning, UEFA demanded that the Ukraine team remove the slogan "Glory to our heroes" from their Euro 2020 kit, following complaints from Russia. UEFA argues that the slogan is too political, as it is associated with the 2014 anti-Russia protests in Ukraine and therefore contravenes rules about not having any political slogans on equipment. This Sunday will see the Copa America, the South American equivalent of the Euros, finally get underway. The opening match will take place between Brazil and Venezuela in the Brazilian capital, Brasilia. Argentina and Colombia were due to co-host the tournament, but pulled out citing COVID-19 concerns. Despite having more COVID cases in both countries, Brazil agreed to host it. Beatriz Ferruja, an international sports journalist, suggests that Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, may have ulterior motives.
Bolsonaro is using the Copa America to send a message that everything is fine in Brazil, that the pandemic doesn't exist. Bolsonaro is trying to ignore the fact that he is under investigation. It is an attempt to have all the attention on Copa America so people can forget about the pandemic and the parliamentary inquiry.
The big screen is back. The Cannes Film Festival starts this weekend after being cancelled last year due to the pandemic. 24 films are competing for the prestigious Palme d'Or, and actors are getting ready for the red carpet. Piotr Shaborodsky has more.
The picture was a sensation.
Cannes is back this year. The world's biggest film festival is set to kick off on 6th July. Its organizers have announced the official lineup of 24 movies that will race for Palme d'Or. Wes Anderson's The French Dispatch, Paul Verhoeven's Benedetta, and Leo Carrac's Annette are among the big favorites. Michał Piepiórka, a cultural expert from the University of Łódź in Poland, says there are so many great movies to expect that almost each of them can be a potential masterpiece.
Since we didn't have the chance to enjoy the event last year, many great movies postponed their premieres to this year, which means the competition will be really intense. And we have many talented filmmakers bringing really fascinating works.
An absence of the festival last year meant a big loss for the whole industry. According to Luke Hicks, a journalist of Film School Rejects, the fact that the Cannes returns this year will be a huge marketing boost for the entire cinema.
Cinema is like the most collaborative medium, and it's like the best way for cultures to communicate through language and to communicate across cultural divides. It's huge in the sense that we're coming off of a pandemic and we expect this to be the weakest Cannes we've ever had, and that's okay, but it's not. This incredible lineup.
Originally scheduled for May, Cannes is returning as one of the first in-person events after the pandemic, and as David Pardillos, a Spanish film critic from Revistas Mutaciones, claims, the organizers will try to make its setup like previous years.
They don't want to make it unique, as they don't think of uniqueness as a positive. They did not want to organize a hybrid version last year and also postponed it this year from May to July, because they want to make it as traditional as possible and to avoid anything extraordinary.
Festival chief Thierry Femou stated in his announcement last week that cinema is not dead. The return of Cannes is the best proof of it. Piotr Przyborowski, City News International.
And now we have some tweets from our followers about Cannes Film Festival. Monica Lillis has said that she's very excited to see the red carpet looks, star eyes and dancing red dress emoji. Well, Monica, I too love a nice flowing ball gown, although I haven't really had a chance to wear one recently.
3 of our listeners want to see The French Dispatch, which has been delayed until this October. Timothy Chalamet is quite the item, I must say.
Right, and I think that's it from our Twitter, although we do encourage you to speak to us more and continue tweeting as we learn more about the Cannes Film Festival as it goes on. Oh wait, I'm just getting one in right now. Elena says she's very excited for Tre Piani, which I'm very excited for too, Elena. Thank you. And now a reminder of today's top stories. Boris Johnson and Joe Biden are meeting ahead of the G7 summit in Cornwall, England.
President Biden is expected to offer developing nations 500 million Pfizer vaccines to ramp up international vaccine rollouts.
And a new Save the Children report warns that at least 51 children were abducted by militant groups in northern Mozambique last year. And that's all that we have time for today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you to our editors and to the team. I'm Mayanda Nduli. Have a blessed day. Goodbye.
And please remember to tweet us if you can. Thank you very much and goodbye.
News from around the world. This is City.
City News International.